Some relief is on the way, it appears, to the many Palestinians still trapped in Gaza where war is ongoing. The United Nations Security Council last night passed a draft resolution on the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. The resolution says that there should be immediate and safe as well as uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. The resolution was postponed, or a vote on the resolution, in fact, was postponed more than once this past week, with the United States calling for a change in the wording. Let's talk more about this now with Sari Bashi. She's the Program Director with Human Rights Watch. You're joining us, Sari. Very good evening from the West Bank tonight. So a lot of your colleagues in the humanitarian space quite underwhelmed by this. In fact, Doctors Without Borders called it a meaningless action by the Security Council last night. Do you agree?
I think it's better than nothing. For weeks and really 2.5 months, the international community has sat by while the Israeli military has slowly drained Gaza of life-saving supplies such as food, fuel, water, and medicine. So it's helpful that the resolution was passed. The United States watered it down but did not veto it, and that's important. I'd like to see it implemented. But mostly, I'd like to see the Israeli military implement its responsibility, not just to stop impeding the supply of humanitarian relief, but to actively provide humanitarian relief to people in Gaza as it's required to do under the laws of occupation.
Just on the point of its implementation, yes, the United Nations Security Council's votes or resolutions are supposed to be binding, but enforcing them, of course, is quite a different issue.
So the text itself is not as robust as I would have liked to have seen. It does not specify that all crossings, land, air, and sea must be used to supply aid. It appoints a coordinator, which is helpful, but I have some concerns about the ability and autonomy of that coordinator to actively and accurately monitor and insist on humanitarian access. Beyond that, what it could have done was something that international humanitarian law requires. It could have called upon Israel to provide aid from its territory into Gaza, to distribute the aid throughout Gaza in the north, middle, and south. Because its troops are there, it has the ability to do so. And that's what armies are required to do when they occupy a territory. And that's what Israel has done in the past. They've facilitated actively humanitarian aid from Israeli territory into Gaza, even during hostilities. So that's not in the resolution. But what is in the resolution is a very clear statement that civilians in Gaza cannot be left to starve, and that something must be done.
And just on that then, the Americans were quite concerned about this wording, even other supporters of Israel saying they were not happy because, for example, they would have wanted stronger condemnation of Hamas and the atrocities it committed in Israel on October 7th to be prominent in the resolution itself. Do you think that is sufficient grounds for the way in which this resolution was handled? Because there were multiple delays, and ultimately, even when it came before the Security Council, it was still clear that those divisions were a problem.
Look, the resolution appropriately calls upon Hamas and Islamic Jihad to immediately and unconditionally release hostages. And that's what international law requires. Holding hostages is a war crime, and all civilian hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. And in the meantime, they must be treated humanely and given access to communication with their families, to medical treatment, and other things. That's correct. My concern is that the so-called backers of Israel, have watered down the implementation language regarding humanitarian supplies. But there is no condemnation too strong of war crimes by Palestinian armed groups in taking hostages. And you can't be too clear in saying that all civilian hostages must be released.
Do you see a scenario in future, perhaps in the near future, especially where ultimately the United Nations Security Council will come up with action that is much more sterner and especially bring an end to the acts of warfare? Because as we're seeing now, the death toll in Gaza has passed 20,000. There was a report I saw earlier, I think from Sky News, where they were saying even Hamas says it's now lost contact with a group that's holding 5 of the hostages taken from Israel in early October. The word famine is also being mentioned more and more in the warnings issued about the situation in Gaza. So clearly quite desperate.
Look, the UN Security Council is playing a helpful role essentially in pushing the United States, which is the Israeli government's largest backer militarily, politically, and diplomatically and economically, to set basic limits on the conduct of the Israeli military. But those limits are far too modest. The Israeli military is permitted to wage war against combatants in Gaza. It is not allowed to deprive children in Gaza of clean water, of food, of safety. And that is what's happening. There's been a 20 to 25 times increase in the cases of diarrhea in children under 5. That's really dangerous. It's because there's no sanitation facilities, there's no latrines. People are squeezed into a very tiny area of southern Gaza with no ability to maintain sanitation. And there's not enough food. There's a serious risk of famine. That is not what the laws of war require you to do. Civilians must be protected. I would hope the UN Security Council, but particularly the United States, which is the driver of these resolutions through its ability to exercise its veto power, I would hope that the United States and the UN would just obey basic principles of international humanitarian law. The United States was appropriately horrified and condemned the actions of Palestinian armed groups on October 7th because they targeted civilians. They killed Israeli civilians. It needs to be as clear and consistent in condemning actions that are putting hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians at risk.
And what about the situation in Rafah currently? More and more people are being pushed further south. There was a warning, I think, in an evacuation order, in fact, in central Gaza in the last 24 hours, ordering people to move further south. Many had fled to areas such as Khan Yunis, but that's no longer safe because it has also been targeted by Israeli airstrikes. Now, for a place such as Rafah, quite close to Egypt, how much longer can that part of Gaza take on more people who are fleeing their homes before it reaches a crisis beyond what we're seeing now?
No place in Gaza is safe. And my concern about the evacuation orders is that the Israeli military is telling people to leave, but there's no safe place to go and no safe way to get there. It is continuing bombing campaigns in Rafah as well. And families are facing impossible choices. They're being told to leave. They don't have anywhere to go. They don't know whether it's better to risk infectious diseases in overcrowded shelters or the weather in the streets. It's raining badly today. It's cold and windy. Or to face Israeli bombings. And there's no guarantee that if they flee to Rafah, they'll be safe there and won't be subject to Israeli attacks. This is not what the laws of war require. Rafah is reaching a breaking point. Gaza is reaching a breaking point. 20,000 people have been killed, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. The vast majority of them civilians. 8,000 children have been killed. That's nearly 100 children per day. It's too much.
Let's speak for a moment then, Sari, as we conclude our conversation about the situation in the West Bank where you're speaking to us from tonight. How safe is the West Bank? It's not governed by Hamas, but we've seen an increasing level of Israeli military raids there as well. How safe is it to be a Palestinian in that part of the Middle East, of the region, currently?
So the Israeli military occupies the West Bank and has a permanent security presence in most of the West Bank. And then in Palestinian cities, there are Palestinian police. But when the Israeli military chooses to enter those cities, they basically pick up the phone to the police and tell them to go away, and then they come in. And what we've seen since October 7th is a significant increase in the Israeli military entering Palestinian cities to conduct arrests, to close down businesses, and also killings of Palestinians. This was already the deadliest year since 2005 for Palestinians in terms of being killed by Israeli soldiers and Israeli settlers. But since October 7th, it's just gone up, including children being killed during arrests, drone strikes by the Israeli military on buildings, especially in the northern West Bank, and a deep sense of insecurity because the army is much more present and it's using excessive force against Palestinians.
Sari, Bashi, good to speak to you. Program Director at Human Rights Watch, speaking to us from the West Bank tonight.